Well, it is a delight to see everyone today. We all have our hectic and busy lives. And so when we have this monthly Bible study, and I've invited the congregation to send me some Bible study questions, and I just knew that I was going to be poked or prodded with some biblical curiosities, and you haven't disappointed me. Well, today I'm going to cover a seemingly odd and arcane subject of King David's mule. King David's mule. If we take a look in 1 Kings and starting in 1 Kings 1, and we in verse 1, we read that King David, who of both the joint kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Now David was old, meaning advanced in years, and they put covers on him, but he couldn't get warm. So he knew that life was becoming more difficult for him. He was becoming weaker, and the palace watchers were watching. Who's going to be the next king in line? It's true everywhere in the world, and it's always been true for the passage of one generation, and who will rise up to be the king in the next generation. And if we take a look as we read through 1 Kings 1, it's really the struggle as to who is going to assume the leadership. And one of David's sons, then Adonijah, decided, you know what? There's a vacuum of leadership here. I'll just seize the kingdom, proclaim myself king now, and I'll do that by inviting everybody to a party. And I'm going to be your new king. I'm the eldest surviving son, so it's my right to grab the kingdom or to just assume it at this time. My father, after all, the presumption is he's old. He can't do anything about it. And so I'll just take over. After all, many years earlier, Absalom had simply usurped the kingdom. And the eldest son, Amnon, was murdered by Absalom, so that took a few of them out of the way. There was another son that was born in there, but we don't read anything about him. So we assume that perhaps a child was died in infancy. We just don't know. So we have this the next son, Adonijah. Hey, it's my turn to be king. Isn't that how it works? And so he had the big party. And we have now then people coming to King David to tell him that, hey, are you aware of what's going on? If we read through 1 Kings 1, are you aware that Adonijah is declaring himself king? And this really wasn't uncommon for one king to put his successor on the throne to ensure that there would be continuity in the kingdom, not just leave it to a civil war afterwards. And so you had Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba coming and saying, are you aware of what's going on? And David did not, because nobody was going to tell him. But they thought, well, maybe that would be just too much for him. And so what then did David do? If we take a look now, the Adonijah didn't invite certain people to this big festivities. He invited all the king's sons. In other words, I am the preeminent son, Adonijah said. And he invited all the sons, but he didn't invite Solomon, and he didn't invite Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet, people that were close to David and knew what the expectation was. And so we then we read in verse 32, in 1 Kings 32, and King David said, call to me Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah, that was one of his mighty men, son of Jehoiada. So they came before the king. Jehoiada was, Benaiah was one of his mighty men, his trusted warriors. And the king also said to them, take with you the servants of your Lord, and have Solomon my son ride on my mule, and take him down to Gihon, there were springs there, and let Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him, meaning publicly, king over Israel. Blow the horn, and he shall come and sit on my throne, and he shall be the king in my place. for I have appointed him to be the ruler over Israel and Judah. Well, the selection of Solomon was an unusual selection for the future king, but because King David's oldest son Amnon was murdered by Absalom, the third son Absalom grabbed the throne for several years and then died. Interestingly, his hair was caught in a tree while he was riding his own mule, Absalom's mule, and then while he was found hanging in the tree by his long hair, he was then murdered. Well, that ended his political career. We now have Adonijah asserted himself to be king because David was old, but Adonijah wasn't chosen king by David, and Solomon was selected instead. Now, there's some that theorize that Solomon was just one of them. Now, by the way, Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, had 5 children. The eldest one died, and she had 4 more sons with David. And if you look at it in 1 Chronicles 3 in verse 5, and these were born to be David in Jerusalem, and it lists them, and Solomon is listed 4th. And you see the same thing when you look in 1 Chronicles, from 1 Chronicles 3:5, you see the same listing in 2 Samuel 5:14. The lists are identical. So it's easy to assume that the list is in chronological order. However, if we go back to 2 Samuel 12:24, we read that after the death of the eldest child, that Bathsheba was comforted, and then the next son that was born was Solomon. So what it appears is a Hebraic methodology of writing, not in sequential order, but the most important one in the last. And we've done this when we've looked at other verses. And I'm thinking of Proverbs 6:16 through 19 on things that God hates. And they become sequentially more important to the end of the most important thing. And so this appears to be that same style here. Now, if we go back to 1 Kings 1 and verse 38, so what did Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet and Benaiah the strong man and then others, what did they do? They followed David's instructions, and they had Solomon ride on King David's mule, and then took him down to, and of course the springs, people would gather there. And so it's mentioned 3 times, 1 Kings where David gave his instructions in 1 Kings 33, then in 1 Kings 38, and in 1 Kings then 43 and 44, where the third mention is of Solomon riding on the king's mule. Well, I want to take a look at the word that there's using for in Strong's Concordance, number 6506. That term only appears 3 times, and we've just reviewed those 3 times. And in Strong's we'll read that it's referring to a female mule, a she-mule. Now, before I go any further, I want to chat a little bit about just what is a mule. And it has the offspring of a male donkey and a female horse. And these horses and donkeys are a different species. And they have different numbers of chromosomes, so as a result, the offspring, the mule, are sterile, at least 99.9+% of the time. There are freaks, apparently, that have occurred in history. And if we take a look at the characteristics of a mule, and the reason that this even comes up today is because of Leviticus 19:19. Why would anybody care if King David had a mule and his son rode a mule? But if we look at Leviticus 19:19, we read this: "You shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your livestock breed with another kind." And it goes on to talk about other mixed things. So it was forbidden in Israel to cross different kinds, 2 different kinds of livestock, or a horse and a mule. And yet, despite this admonition, we know that David had a mule, and indeed his sons rode mules. If we look in Deuteronomy chapter 17, in Deuteronomy 17, in 14 through 16, you might read some of the reasons that David and his sons may have ridden mules. Now, in Deuteronomy 17 is a chapter that kings of Israel were supposed to read and follow. These are instructions to kings. If you're going to be a king, here's what you need to follow. If we go through Deuteronomy 17, when you come, and starting in verse 14, when you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. Wow, and that's what they did later. God was explaining that this is what you're going to want to do, as he knew human characteristics. Verse 15, you shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your brethren you shall set as the king over you. You may not set as a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. Verse 16, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. So David was following this, from all appearances, was following the instruction to not do like they did in Egypt, or as others did, and multiply horses to himself. And of course, later, as we'll read, unfortunately, Solomon did not follow that instruction. So, if we take a look, what separates out the royal family from the others is that they possess things that were scarce. What is scarce? Gold, silver, and mules. And if you take a look, because no mules were produced in Israel, the mules had to come from outside of Israel. So they were a rarity, which made them very expensive. And this rare or expensive thing then would signify that it was a family of wealth or power and importance. So if you take a look at, well, why would you want a mule instead of a horse? Well, I did a little research on mules. Mules, the offspring of a male sire and a female horse, there are different characteristics that come out that a mule. For example, a horse will often live 20 years, and some Arabians will live 30 years. A mule can live up to 50 years, but then they're not reproducing, so they can live longer. The mule is considered valuable because it's stronger than a horse, pound for pound of similar size, but has the endurance and disposition of a donkey, requires less food than a horse, and its feet have harder hooves so it can handle rockier or more difficult soil. The endurance is better than a horse, but they can't run as fast, but they have more endurance. Mules, of course, have the conformation or the height of a horse, not of the sire of the donkey. It's interesting, the mule websites that I went to, they said that their skin is harder or thicker and less sensitive than a horse. Now, when I was a teenager, I had a horse. And that horse got into some barbed wire. And barbed wire a horse's skin will tear very easily. And as a result, you can't stitch it back together because the thread will come right through the stitches. So you can't stitch the horse. So if the flap can't be sealed somehow. Now, nowadays, they super glue them. If a horse has a cut, they will glue it shut. They will tape it as best they can. But super glue is the modern way of doing it. But a mule has thicker skin, so it tends to be more resistant of weather, of sun and rain, more resistant to disease and insects, and particularly more endurance. We've heard of the Borax 20 mule team that hauls borax out of Death Valley. The colors can be just as many colors as there are horses. So if we take a look, it's said to be the most common and oldest man-made or man-created hybrid that was documented in 3,000 years before Christ, that they were produced commercially from time to time. The mules were produced by a fellow by the name of George Washington, who was the first USA president, which is recorded to have produced 57 mules on his farm in Mount Vernon, saying that there was superior value for the army, so they wanted something that was hardy. Now, we are the closest church congregation to the Pea Ridge annual mule jump in Arkansas for this part of the world. Now, you'd say, what about jumping mules? Well, there are a lot of raccoons, and of course, those who are sporty like to have their horses and chase the raccoons. But a mule has a different capacity than a horse. So I don't know if you've ever been to the mule jump. I have not, but I've read about it. And since it's, less than 30 miles from here, a mule, what they do is they put a rack up with a pole, and they put a blanket over the pole so it looks solid. But unlike a horse that will take a running jump over the pole, the mule can do what a horse cannot. The mule has a halter on it and a rope with the owner, and the mule has to jump over the pole with the blanket on it from a standstill, just like a cat. Now, I've seen some interesting videos of a coyote doing that from a standstill with a spring in the legs and jumping vertically. The highest known jump was in 1989 here in Pea Ridge by a mule named Sonny, cleared a bar of 72 inches standing from a standstill. So there was unusual characteristics of these mules, and I knew that they had mule jumps in Bishop, California, because I used to work in California, and they did something similar there. There they have a 6-day festival, but I didn't know much about the characteristics other than stubborn as a mule. Idioms, for example. Well, where does that idiom come from? Stubborn as a mule. Unlike a horse, a mule has the capacity to know what its limit is. A horse will literally work until it drops and then dies, whereas a mule will go to a certain point, and then that's it. It will stop. It's stubborn because it knows what its limits are. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but they say you can't outguess a mule in that regard. If we take a look then, what did Solomon do in 1 Kings 4 and verse 26? Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. Looks like he didn't really absorb the lesson in Deuteronomy 17 about what should a king not do. Now, David was mindful, because if you have lots of mules, they're not going to reproduce, so you're not going to multiply to yourself those mules. Whereas Solomon wished to increase his strength. We read on in 1 Kings 10:28, Solomon had horses imported from where? From Egypt, right where he was not supposed to go, and they bought them in the market at the current price. 2 Chronicles 1:16, Solomon had horses imported from Egypt and Keva. The king's merchant brought them in. 2 Chronicles 9:25, Solomon had 4,000 stalls for horses and chariots and 12,000 horsemen. And he stationed in chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. And 2 Chronicles 9:28, and they brought horses to Solomon from Egypt and all over. So he wasn't following the instructions not to multiply horses, or for that matter, wives, and other things to himself, which would have allowed him to be a better king. So David was more mindful of that by having a mule. It was distinguishing to royalty because it was so rare. And those of you, and we've all lived through the basic understanding of economics, if something is more rare, the price is higher. And if something is pretty common, the price is lower. So only those who could afford it, had a particular need for it, could afford then a mule. Same thing is similar with a dye. Red dye or purple dye was very expensive. And so only those generally it was a color of royalty because they're the only ones that could afford it. So if we go back to Deuteronomy 17:16, David had a mule. He wasn't multiplying horses to himself. In fact, I was reading an interesting a blurb on it. I didn't write it down here, but when David then conquered other tribes, whether it was or groups, whether it was the Assyrians or others, he didn't take the horses. He only took a few horses home. The rest of them he left there. He eliminated the horses, but he did not take them to himself. So, and I thought, well, why would this occur? I mean, what is the symbology of the new king coming riding in with his entourage to be announced as the new king, in this case in a mule? So if we take a look, and let's jump to Revelation 19, and we're going to see in Revelation 19, starting in verse 11, we're going to see another case of a king, a coming king, a future king. In Revelation 19, starting in verse 11, and so we can think of this as an antitype where somebody is riding in to assume a kingdom. Verse 11, now I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on him was called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes were like flames of fire. On his head were many crowns. He had a name written that no one knew except himself. He was clothed with a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, followed him on a white horse. Now out of his mouth goes a sharp sword, that with it he should strike the nations, and he himself will rule them with a rod of iron. He himself treads the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of the Almighty God, and he has on his robe and his thigh the name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So that time is coming when Jesus Christ will return, and it's given here as if it were on a white horse. So royalty coming, riding a steed, and similar as this antitype. Now, it wasn't a white horse. Could have been white. In fact, all the pictures that I see of artists depicting the time of David will show a white mule, and certainly could have been a white mule. Would certainly be distinctive and difficult to produce. So we'll take up the rest of the verse as to regards to the and where is my verse now? Regards to Leviticus 19:19 about mixing with other kinds, we'll take that up because that's a bigger subject, and we'll do that at another time, about sowing your field with mixed seed or garment with mixed linen and so forth, linen and wool. That's all for today.